All right, so hello everyone. My name is Abby Currier and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I'm so excited to see everyone on here tonight, and I look forward to learning more this evening about voting rights in Minnesota. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather, socially distant of course, and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the stories of Olmsted County and southeastern Minnesota. We are so excited that you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Lori Sturdevant about Turnout, Making Minnesota the State That Votes. After her presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, feel free to put any questions that you may have in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. But before we can get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of logistical things. For tonight, we are going to ask everyone to please stay muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can at the end. We may also put some links in there throughout the night, so make sure that you keep an eye on it. Anything that we put into the chat, we will be sure to send to you tomorrow, along with a quick survey about tonight's program. It will take less than 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching this in presenter view, but if you want to see everyone participating, you can do that by clicking presentation view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you are joining us from an iPad, you may have to swipe a couple of times to get the view to change. We are recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. We're so excited about tonight's talk and hope that you will continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will talk about everything from the Confederate battle flag to caves to Antarctic exploration and so much more. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we are joined by Lori Sturdevant, who is a retired editorial writer and columnist for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Her 43-year career at the newspaper focused on coverage of state politics and government. She is the author, co-author, or editor of 12 books about noteworthy Minnesotans. Lori?
Well, thank you, Abby, and it's a treat to be with all of you tonight. This particular program was a long time in being scheduled, and we were hoping to be with Joan Grow tonight as well. She sends her regrets. She's been struggling with some health issues, and I really wish that she could be along here to tell some of her own stories about her career, but I'll try to do my best to share some of that information with you as I talk about the importance of the topic that Joan and I worked on, which was voter turnout in Minnesota. Well, voting in general in Minnesota. Joan was Minnesota's Secretary of State for 24 years, 24 very formative years from 1974 to 1998. And it was during that time that Minnesota really established itself with a reputation nationally as the state that votes, hence our title of our book, Turnout, Making Minnesota the State That Votes. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you tonight, and so I'm going to see if I know how to do screen sharing and get that on my screen here. Here we go. I'm always struggling with this because I have to find the share button. There it is. And we'll do play from the start. Here we go. Is this working for you?
Yep, I can see it.
All right, that's my title page. And we're showing here the cover of the book that came out in August of 2020, but this particular version of the cover isn't quite like the book that may have been sent to some of you. It was an early version. We wound up using the actual I voted sticker that Joan and Joe Mansky designed and began to use in the early 1990s to great popularity in Minnesota. And there's something at the bottom of this book that I'm proud of that I want to highlight. It says, with a foreword by Hillary Rodham Clinton. Joan approached Hillary Clinton in October of 2019 at an event. They knew each other, but not terribly well. And Hillary couldn't have been more gracious. And when Joan told her what we were up to, Hillary agreed quickly to writing a foreword, and she did, we think, a beautiful job. So we're proud to have her words at the beginning of this book. Well, I'll see if I can advance our screen here. It turns out that voting and turnout matters are really the stuff of almost everyday news right now in 2021, not an election year, but a year in which so many state legislatures are considering changes in voting rules and regulations, the procedures of elections, changes that tend to alarm a lot of the watchdogs who have been urging for broader franchise, more people voting. A lot of these changes seem to be designed to discourage voting. This is just an example of some of the headlines that we've seen of late. But this morning I went to the Brennan Center from New York University, where they keep tabs on such things. 14 states have enacted 22 laws so far this year that would restrict voting in some way. There are still 18 more states that are considering as many as 61 bills. And those states are some of our largest states, including Florida, Georgia, Arizona. You may have heard that Texas wasn't able to get its vote restriction bill out because Democratic legislators, though they are in the minority, were able to walk out and stop a vote, denying the quorum that they needed to act. But there's going to be a special session, I understand, in Texas that will take up a vote restriction bill. So this is really the stuff of lots of news. The scope of all this is really sweeping. A lot of these bills involve making it harder to vote absentee and by mail. As you recall, in the 2020 election, President Trump claimed that there was something fraudulent about voting by mail, even though he himself did so. That making it harder to vote absentee by mail, for example, not allowing people to sign up in one election cycle to receive an absentee ballot in the next one. Some of these bills would purge from the registration lists or purge from the absentee voting list people who missed an election, who didn't vote in a particular election. Many of these bills would either eliminate or make more difficult election day registration, which is something Minnesota pioneered back in 1974, something that's been crucial to Minnesota being the state that votes. And the most worrisome changes that I'm hearing about from some of the experts in this realm would put legislators, rather than independently elected secretaries of state, in charge of counting votes or in charge of appointing the head of, say, a canvassing committee. That would politicize the counting of votes in a way that we have not seen in this country. And it's worrisome stuff. See if I can make this go forward. Now, Minnesota is not one of the 14 states that have enacted some laws to restrict voting, but where voting limits are in vogue in Minnesota too. As you see here, back in early May, the Republican-controlled Minnesota Senate passed a photo ID requirement. It didn't go anywhere this session, but it was a clear signal that if the Minnesota House were to fall into Republican hands in the 2022 election, if the governorship should become a Republican governor again in 2022, this is very much on their agenda, despite the fact that in 2012, the Minnesota voters, by a rather substantial majority, rejected the idea of having a photo ID requirement to vote. Did so in part because there was good evidence that the people who lacked a government issued ID that would be required to vote would be some of our poorest citizens, some of our elderly people of color who were born at a time in the South when there weren't birth certificates, and students who move frequently are often the ones who are really disadvantaged by photo ID requirements. That bill did pass the state Senate in Minnesota, signaling that there is still interest in that kind of restriction in Minnesota. And what that bill would also do is make election day registration much more difficult. Now, what's disturbing to me about that move in Minnesota is Minnesota's strong reputation since the 1990s, nationally and even internationally, as the state that does elections right. We're the state that votes. We've led the nation in voter turnout in 10 of the last 12 presidential elections, and routinely we lead the nation in midterm elections as well. We were in first place 4 times. I'm not sure if I've got that up to date. I know we were very much in first place in 2018 when we were seeing remarkably high turnout for a midterm election. Why is it so? Why did that happen? That Minnesota became such a voting state, and it's partly because of what Abby and I were talking about shortly before this meeting began. Minnesota's roots are those of a New England state. So many of our early settlers in the mid-19th century were from New England, an area of the country that believed strongly in in citizen participation in self-governance. The people who came to New England were clearly anti-monarchist. They were often in congregational churches that believed in the congregational lay people governance of their churches. They had a strong town meeting tradition. I think our precinct caucuses spring directly from that tradition. And they liked lots of government with many layers and many offices to fill, that many people, then it was men, many men in the town would take their turn at these offices. That it's probably not a coincidence that the largest legislature in the country is that of New Hampshire, and the second largest is Minnesota. We believed in having small legislative districts, a closeness of the people to their representatives. That was the tradition that established this state in the 1850s. And then it was soon after the Civil War, we got a big dose of Scandinavian population in Minnesota, Germans as well, but that Scandinavian reinforcement was critical because the Scandinavian too have a strong tradition of communitarian governance, of using of much citizen involvement in their politics, going way, way back. So we had in Minnesota that happy union of Yankee and Scandinavian tradition that put Minnesota's population in a pattern of voting that got reinforced then in the 20th century. There's no stronger voice in our country in the middle of the 20th century for civil rights than Hubert Humphrey. He was the US Senate floor leader in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and then helped to craft the Voting Rights Act, passed the following year, 1965. By then, Hubert Humphrey is vice president, but is very much still pushing for that and being one of the engineers of that as then as vice president, the president of the Senate. Voting rights emphasis of Humphrey was very formative in Minnesota, was very much representative of what was then a bipartisan consensus in Minnesota, that we needed to have a pretty wide open door to the polls. Governor Wendell Anderson said voting is a right and not a privilege in his 1973 State of the State address. And that became kind of a mantra for Joan Grow, with whom I did this book. It's a simple statement, but it's a powerful one. If voting is a right that belongs to the people, then it's not something that government ought to be free to crimp in any way. Government's role is to facilitate the exercise of that right, not to restrict. Turnout, I think, high turnout has made a big difference in Minnesota. People who vote vote frequently, are closer to their government. They better understand and appreciate what government does. And they have more confidence in their own ability to hold their government to account and to have government respond to their needs. That means when trouble does come up, and we've had trouble in this last year or so, people that vote frequently are more trusting that government can be an effective and fair problem-solving tool. So high voter turnout gives government legitimacy. I think it helps weaken the grip of extremists on political parties. When you have a lot of people turning out for elections, the politics is in the control of the people as a whole and not extremists in political parties. And it tends to give that emphasis, that high turnout tends to give elected officials an incentive to compromise and keep government functional, something that we need. Well, for 24 years, Joan Grow was the face of the state that votes in Minnesota. She really took to heart that Wendell Anderson line, voting is a right and not a privilege. And when she was a legislator in her one and only term in the Minnesota House in 1973 and 74, she saw an election bill passed that created same-day registration. And she noticed that the Republican Secretary of State, Arlen Erdahl, didn't support that change, didn't favor election day registration, thought it would be too complicated or too costly, and had other excuses. She thought, that's not right. The person who administers elections ought to be supportive of this change and ought to help make it happen. That was one of the reasons she decided in 1974 to run for Secretary of State herself. She had, as you see a little bit about her background here on this slide, she was a native of Buffalo, Minnesota. Her dad was involved in local politics, but was not at all a partisan. If anything, she says she was raised by a Republican family. She was an educator herself and got involved in politics because of the Vietnam War and because of the good work of the League of Women Voters, which is an organization that we can't say enough good about. So she runs for Secretary of State in 1974, which was a good year for a Democrat to run for office in the state. That was the post-Watergate election. And what the consequence of Watergate in this state anyway was a big drop in Republican turnout. Something like 200,000 Republicans who voted 4 years earlier in the midterm election 4 years earlier didn't show up at the polls in 1974. The result was a DFL sweep and the highest number of DFL legislators ever elected. That record stands still. Joan was the first woman elected statewide in her own right. And that in her own right line is significant because there was a previous female Secretary of State, Mrs. Mike Holm. She insisted on being on the ballot as Mrs. Mike Holm. Mike was her husband who had died in office. He had been Secretary of State for 30 years, and she wanted to continue in his office by embracing as much as she could that name, hence Mrs. Mike Holm. Her opponent went to the courts to try to get her to use her real name, which is Virginia, and the court decision was that the case had been filed too late. And so Mrs. Mike did win the 1952 election for Secretary of State. She was out of office in the next election in 1954. 20 years later, then Joan Grow does win as a female, being elected in her own right to the Secretary of State's office. And that was a real breakthrough and a milestone at a time when there was a lot of that happening for women. And we'll talk more about all of that in a moment. Joan's record as Secretary of State is in a really impressive one because election day registration was in its infancy when she took office. It had been started in 1974, kind of haltingly, with a lot of local officials not quite knowing how to proceed. She standardized the whole system, got some of the kinks and bugs out, dealt with the legislature to do so, did a lot of work on training of election judges and of local officials, and then it tapped a lot of private and nonprofit resources to make the promotion of voting the real central theme of the Secretary of State's office. I found an old memo from one of the former Deputy Secretary of States who said that the main purpose of the Secretary of State's office is to be the state's archive, which is actually the purpose of the Historical Society, I may say, but it was not, certainly that was not Joan Grow's focus. Her idea was the Secretary of State's office should be about implementing the whole notion that voting is a right, not a privilege. So that's what she loved to work on. She was overseeing the computerization of her office, which was not a small thing, and insisted that we continue to vote with something that would leave a paper trail. The reason we have optical scanning equipment today, not something with hanging chads or weird butterfly pokes or other kinds of touchscreen technology that could be hacked. We have a paper trail that can be recounted. Joan Grow insisted on that optical scanning equipment and got that in place well before some other states ran into real trouble with their voting equipment. It's because of Joan Grow that we can turn to the Secretary of State's office on election night for centralized, reliable reporting of results. We don't have multiple tallying of results that can cause all kinds of difficulties. She insisted on that. She was a reformer who promoted the idea that we should make registration easy through motor voter. Minnesota motor voter is that when you go to the motor vehicle place to get your driver's license or go to deal with government in any other way, you have an opportunity to register to vote there. You're given a form. Some of us would like to see that become automatic, but Joan Grow pushed for motor voter in 1987. And it became the law of the land in 1973, in part because of the actions of a Minnesotan, Dave Dernberger, in the US Senate. Joan was really a big backer of allowing for voting by mail. And she was delighted this year in 2020 when she was able to vote by mail herself. Voting by mail is something that was allowed a little bit in response to her calls, but she began pushing in 1987 for no excuses absentee voting. It wasn't enacted in Minnesota until 2013. It took 26 years for the state legislature to see the wisdom in what she was urging. She was a big pusher for reforms to increase primary turnout, to improve precinct caucuses. Many of her ideas in something called the Grow Commission, which was a commission that acted in 1995, those are still good ideas today. The legislature is very slow to make changes in this realm, but Joan was trying all those years to be a reformer and was getting national and international attention as she did. As I mentioned, Joan was also a pioneer for women in Minnesota, no more so than in 1984 when she won the DFL endorsement for the US Senate. You maybe see a byline that you might recognize on the story there, as we reported the long endorsement battle she had in mid-June of 1984 to win endorsement over 4 men, including a former governor, Wendell Anderson, to be the DFL's candidate against Rudy Boschwitz that year. She lost that election. It was a tough election, but nevertheless, she made history and was seen as a woman who would pave the way for other female candidates to follow. She ran in 1984. It took 22 years before Amy Klobuchar was the first woman elected to the US Senate from Minnesota. So when Joan Grow left office in 1998, she was by that time internationally recognized as an authority on election administration. The United Nations had gotten a hold of Joan Grow and were sending her all over the world. Look at these places where she had done some work. Romania, the first democratic election in Romania, she was there. South Africa, another first, the first post-apartheid election in South Africa, she was there. Azerbaijan, El Salvador, Peru, and Yemen. Apparently, when one becomes a voting expert, one can travel the world, and she certainly did as part of United Nations teams. Those were important opportunities because lots of international recognition, international aid would flow when a group of election authorities like Joan would certify that the country was serious about democracy. And so the reports that these UN teams brought back were notable. It also gave Joan some talking points in Minnesota about the importance of voting. And she saw how people in new democracies craved that opportunity to cast a ballot. And she wanted that kind of enthusiasm for voting to remain strong in Minnesota. Well, fast forward to today and to the 2020 election, Joan and I kept talking about our voting system having a coronavirus challenge last year. Would voter turnout stay high in a situation where it was hard to call on people to gather in polling places or stand in lines and possibly risk their health? I kept arguing that there was something about the pandemic that made people want to assert control over their lives as in any way that they could, and voting was one of the ways to do that. We had just a remarkable turnout in 2020, leading the nation with a huge surge in absentee balloting. We had an 80% turnout in Minnesota. We can be very proud of that. But 80% turnout still means that 1 out of every 5 voters didn't vote. And that means we still have some way to go in Minnesota to have the franchise being fully exercised by lots of people. This is a chart that I wish I had Olmsted County to include on. It just shows the growth in voter turnout between 2016 and 2020 in the Twin Cities area. It was probably true in other counties as well, but I think these are rather substantial gains in voter turnout. The ability to vote easily by mail was a big part of that story. Notice that it's both Republican leaning counties and DFL leaning counties that saw this kind of surge. And I'm a little disappointed that my own home county, Ramsey, was at the bottom of this list, but even Ramsey saw some gain. Somebody asked me in my last conversation about all of this, why was Ramsey the laggard? Well, Ramsey has a larger population of people of color who haven't been voting in as big a numbers. It has a larger population of young people. It's in fact, I think our youngest county by average age. That points to where there's still an opportunity for growth in our voter turnout in Minnesota. This is a sentence I liked very much from chapter 10. About voter registration. It really is, voter registration is something we've been fighting about in this country for a long time. It's a 19th century idea that was concocted, near as we can tell, in the state of New York in the 1830s and 40s to keep Irish immigrants from voting. And then it was used in the Jim Crow era as a way to keep African Americans from voting, even though the 15th Amendment to the US Constitution granted them the vote for almost 100 years. That vote was effectively denied to them because of some of the opportunities that the states had to interfere with voter registration. We had 56 years ago, the Voting Rights Act passes. I've referenced that before. Not only was Hubert Humphrey involved in that, but Minnesota's brand new US Senator Walter Mondale was very much involved in passing that Voting Rights Act. And that Voting Rights Act has been, I don't want to say gutted, but has been severely dented by the US Supreme Court in a case called Shelby County in 2013. We still have concerns, obviously, about getting people the opportunity to exercise their constitutional right to vote. And that's what some of the news has been all about this year. Joan and I believe that there is more that can be done even in a state like Minnesota to make it easier for people to vote, especially those who have a criminal record. This is something that we've been talking about for some time in Minnesota. In a state like Minnesota, there are other states like this around the country. Once someone is, most states don't allow people who are felons in prison to vote. That's an idea that goes back to the Confederate states at the turn of the 20th century. Many states, Minnesota among them, won't allow people who have been convicted of felonies to vote until they are completely off paper, meaning that they're through with their probation. And in Minnesota, probation can be long. It can be 5 years. It can be 10 years. That long probationary period gives an opportunity for people out of confusion to cast votes that they're really not eligible to cast. And when people say there's been voter fraud in Minnesota, that's the only kind of fraud that has occurred with any frequency whatsoever. It's the people who are still on paper, convicted felons who are now out of prison, thinking that they are eligible to vote, casting a ballot, and it turns out they're not. The penalty for that is pretty stiff. You can be sent back to prison for a year for voting when you shouldn't. So this is a serious problem. There are beginning to be other states, and North Dakota is one of them, that have, I think, a much simpler approach to all of this. They say, if you're in prison, you can't vote. If you're out of prison, no matter what your status is with regard to probation, if you're out of prison, you can vote. It's they think of voting as part of the reattachment to the community that ought to happen when people leave a prison sentence. I like that approach. I'd like to see our legislature go in that direction. There have been bills introduced in the Minnesota legislature for at least a dozen years to do this, and so far it hasn't caught on, but I wish it would. Other ideas about how we can make voting more of a right and less of a privilege in Minnesota, to create automatic voter registration when anyone interacts with government. You shouldn't have to fill out a separate form when you go to that driver's license window. Fill out your driver's license form and that'll take care of voter registration as well. Something like 17 or 18 states do this already. Minnesota would have been the first if Governor Tim Pawlenty hadn't vetoed a bill in 2009 that would have allowed Minnesota to do this. Now we're going to be not the first, but we're still a state that ought to consider doing this. So should Minnesota consider pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds as part of their high school civics classes, which many other states do. And then we've seen just in this last year the importance of early polling stations. A lot of absentee ballot drop boxes. The opportunity to vote early is something that we really appreciated during this pandemic and something we can do better at. This latter point, increase about early polling stations and absentee ballot boxes. That's what a lot of states are now trying to restrict as they try to, as their state legislatures try to clamp down on voting opportunities. Minnesota should go the other way. This is the part of the last lines of Joan's book, that the greatest threat to voting rights, and I probably need to see this in the book rather than on the screen to be able to really read it to you. The greatest threat to voting rights is not the handiwork of a foreign foe. It's internal to us as Americans. It's the erosion of democracy that ensues when people allow themselves to become cynical about voting, when they let themselves believe that voting doesn't matter or that their vote won't count. That idea needs to be called out and challenged, not just by elder statesmen and stateswomen like me, but by everyone who cherishes democracy. I think that's an important idea that Minnesotans, I think, resonate with, and I'm hoping that that there will be other people rising up in generations younger than Joan and me to help make that argument. This is a little sales pitch for our book. I understand some of you have received the book, and thank you for your interest. If you would like to order more of them, they're available through the Minnesota Historical Society Press, our publisher, and at most Minnesota bookstores. Abby, I would be ready for some questions from this group. What do you have for me?
I was muted during the presentation. So I haven't seen any questions come in through the chat, but if anyone has them, feel free to put them in there, or even if you want to unmute yourself or like raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask questions directly if you would prefer that option. But I guess just to kick us off, Lori, what initially drew you to this topic? Like why did you chose to work with Joan and write on this?
Yeah, I've known Joan since the early 80s. I was the Minneapolis Tribune and then the Star Tribune's reporter assigned to covering that 1984 Senate race. But I knew her a bit before that because, of course, voting is some of what those of us who cover the state capitol are covering. And Joan was a very visible and active Secretary of State well before she ran for the Senate in 1984. She could have been, some would say should have been, a candidate for lieutenant governor in 1982. Warren Spanis was the DFL endorsee that year. He went with what he thought was a safe choice of a male legislator from St. Peter as his running mate. The next day, someone approached former Governor Rudy Perpich on the campaign trail and said, what do you think of Warren's choice? Rudy was Warren's challenger in that DFL primary in 1982. Rudy's response was, he should have picked Joan Grow. I think Rudy believed, and I believe, if Warren had indeed chosen Joan Grow, who would have been then the first female lieutenant governor in the state, I think that might have made a difference in that primary, which of course we all know Rudy Perpich won, and Rudy Perpich going on to be our state's longest serving governor with the female running mate, Marlene Johnson.
So are town meetings still happening in Minnesota? Like what do those small caucuses you were talking about look like?
Well, precinct caucuses are certainly part of our system. That's how our political parties organize themselves and how they decide on endorsements for offices of all kinds, local offices, legislative offices, state offices. We've also had a rather up and down, back and forth history with regard to presidential primaries. And we used to be a caucus state with regard to primaries. For many years we were. Back in 2020, we went back to being a primary state for, I think, the fourth or fifth time. It went pretty well despite the pandemic in 2020. And so I kind of think in 2024, we will still be again for presidential elections, a primary state. We have in Minnesota always had the opportunity for a primary subsequent to party endorsements, sort of as the notion was that the rank and file would provide a check on the decisions of the party. That's a theory that hasn't always played out so neatly, but nevertheless, we have both. We have this dual system in Minnesota, precinct caucuses that lead to party endorsements, and then primaries that actually determine the nominations. That preference for precinct caucuses, which are neighborhood meetings to decide not only preferences for candidacies, but also for party platforms. That's, I think, a direct descendant of town meetings, which was the opportunity to run government once a year or sometimes more frequently than that by gathering all the citizens, all the eligible citizens. And in those years, it was largely male, but these things exist in New England to this day, and you can attest to that in smaller communities. Get the town folks together, do some of the local elections, set some local policy. That approach, everybody participating, is something that's very much part of Minnesota's heritage as well as New England's heritage.
So we have a question submitted from Jane Callahan. Is the large number of voter suppression laws being submitted in state legislatures in part due to laws being pre-drafted by outsiders, i.e. not written by state legislatures, and made available to the said legislatures?
Well, very much so. It is the case that on many fronts, bills that are moving through the legislature, be they carried by Republicans or Democrats, are written by outside forces. And because we've seen such nationalization of our politics, many times you see dozens of state legislatures considering the very same kind of bills at the very same time, coming out of groups like something called ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council or Commission, something like that. That's a very conservative group funded by the Koch brothers that put up a lot of model legislation over the past dozen years. But they're certainly not alone. Lots of groups will offer legislators model bills. This is very much this year a coordinated effort. And I do question whether we would have seen in Minnesota that attempt to require a photo ID to vote, something that our voters turned down in 2012, would we have seen that were it not for this national effort on the part of the Republican Party to put some more voting restrictions in place, and our Minnesota Republicans wanting not to be left behind.
So pivoting a little bit, how long does it take to write this book?
Joan and I worked pretty intently on it for a little more than a year, I think. And that was that for me, that was sort of record time, but I had retired from the Star Tribune at that point. So I had a little more time during the day to work on this sort of thing than I had with some of my previous projects. I retired at the end of 2018 from the newspaper, though I still do about one column a month.
So is that from conception to publication is about a year?
Yes, well, in this case, you'd have to say conception was long before that. Joan had been thinking about a book, and she and I had off and on talked about a book for a long time. What got us jump-started this time, I'll tell you, was a call from the Historical Society Press manager, who said, we've got the anniversary of women's suffrage, the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage coming up in 2020. We'd like to be able to offer some titles that have something to do with that. What have you got? He said, and I said, say, Joan Grow and I have been talking about a book for a long time. So we got busy and got it done.
Yeah, we saw a lot of different titles coming out last year in celebration of that anniversary.
Well, and Joan deserves to be remembered as a feminist pioneer in Minnesota. We had a flurry of feminist activity when the first wave of suffrage was upon us in the late teens and early 20s, 100 years ago. But then we went into this long, dry, fallow period in Minnesota where some not great things happened for women who went into politics. I'll mention the name Koya Knutson, and those of you who know that story will cringe at the very mention of the name. I wrote a good deal about that in the book that was published in 2014, Her Honor, Rosalie Wall and the Minnesota Women's Movement. The women's movement springs back into consciousness and into life in Minnesota in the late 1960s. And that's at the same time that Joan is much involved with the League of Women Voters and involved as an opponent to the Vietnam War. The mother at that point of 4 kids, 3 of them boys, she was concerned about what would happen if that war turned into a long quagmire, and it almost did. So that's what got her involved. And then the League of Women Voters is a remarkable organization. It kind of kept the feminist flame burning during those long, dark, fallow years from 1922 until 1970, when it kind of springs back to life in Minnesota.
And this, I hope you'll understand, and maybe we'll be able to provide some more context to me, but how will HR 1 affect Minnesota?
I'm not as well versed on all the details of HR 1 as I should be, and so I apologize about that. But as I understand it, HR 1 would bring to other states some of what Minnesota has enjoyed all along. We've had same-day registration, as I said, since 1974. Steve Simon, our current Secretary of State, told me that that's the jewel in our crown when it comes to turnout. That makes such a difference. People don't know in Minnesota and have known for a long time that if they have moved, if their driver's license has expired, whatever it is, they can register with the right kind of materials proving their residence. They can register at the polls on election day and cast a ballot. And that ballot is not provisional. You don't have to come back to the county courthouse with more documents the next day as you would have to with provisional ballots. That's an actual vote that gets counted. That has made a huge difference in Minnesota. Same-day registration would be nationwide. And I think automatic voter registration, which we talked about before, is part of that bill as well. It's in a way motor voter point 2. Bill Clinton signed the original federal motor voter bill, which modeled on Minnesota's law back in 1993. Like I mentioned, 18 or so states have now got automatic voter registration, making that a national standard would make sense. Those are the kinds of things. That plus, I believe HR 1 has some information about, or has some prescriptions about redistricting. And we haven't talked about that yet tonight, but that is certainly part of our system and part of our story in Minnesota. We've had probably a bigger share of competitive legislative districts, competitive congressional districts than some other states have, and competition drives up turnout. We've had more than many states have, because we have had courts doing our redistricting pretty much every time, not done by legislators. Legislators have the power under our Constitution to do redistricting, but we've had divided legislatures time and time again. And so the legislature, this year, the legislature didn't even try. They just let the courts take over. The courts will draw our lines again this year.
Do the lines get redrawn every year for redistricting?
The redistricting happens every 10 years after a new census. And many states use that opportunity to have their legislatures draw as many safe seats for the party, the dominant party of their state as possible. Do that over a few cycles, and you do wind up driving down turnout, because people think, what's the point of voting? I know the outcome before we even would set foot in the polls. That's not been the way in Minnesota. We have had quite a number of very competitive legislative districts and congressional districts.
So what can community members do to ensure fair redistricting?
I think keep an eye on it. The system for this year is it's in place, and those the Minnesotans already did their part by filling out their census forms last year. You may have heard that Minnesota was considered a state likely to lose a congressional district last year because of the relatively comparatively slow growth in our state's population. But Minnesota again led the nation. I keep talking about our great willingness to participate. We led the nation in completing our census forms. And as a result, we've got a more complete count of our population than many states. And we kept 8 congressional districts, and some other states, New York being one, I think California being one, lost seats. So we Minnesotans can hold their head up in that regard. We've done our part. Now we sit back and hope that the courts do theirs. And so far, so good. We have a case that has been taken over by the state Supreme Court. I look for, as soon as the legislature is really done this year, I look for our state Supreme Court Chief Justice Lori Sturdevant to appoint a panel to begin the actual work of drawing new district lines.
So then can I ask, you said you're waiting for when the legislature is done. I was never good in poli-sci class. What is the legislature term? Like when does that happen?
When is the legislature done? We have a state constitution that was rewritten by Jack Davies in 1972 and 3 that specifies that the legislature's regular session every year must be done by the third Monday, or is it it's the Monday after the third Saturday, I think it's how it goes, in May. So our regular session ended on May 17th this year, if you look at the calendar, but it ended without completing the budget, which it must do by July 1st, or there will be a government shutdown, which we have had twice in recent years. So, and they're not nice. We don't want to do another government shutdown. So they are now in special session. They were called back into special session because of the governor's emergency powers, but that was something they knew was going to happen, and they need to finish that budget. The legislature meets every year in Minnesota. Typically, the odd numbered year is the longer session. It is the one that sets the biennial budget. The even numbered year is often a shorter session, starts a little later, but also must be done by that third Monday in May. And that often is doing more policy bills, and often does a bonding bill in that even year session. It also does the kinds of things that will set people up, or so they think, for good outcomes in the legislative election, which will then ensue. There's talk about changing the legislative calendar, and I'd be interested in knowing if anybody in this group has a strong feeling about that. Going to longer sessions, maybe going to annual budgeting, making every year a budget session. These are some of the ideas that are floating around.
Yeah, see, we never covered any of that. Has there been any one demographic increasing their voting significantly more than others?
Well, in Minnesota, we've always had more trouble getting younger people to vote. And I haven't taken a good look at what happened in 2020. I know from 2018, we had a nice increase in the share of younger voters who participated. It was something like a 10 percentage point jump up from in 2018 as compared with 4 years previously. I haven't got those 2020 figures, but that's, I mentioned earlier, if you were to look at why is Ramsey County kind of lagging in growth? Well, it's a younger county and it's got more racial diversity. And we have also seen less willingness to vote in big numbers on the part of people of color, though that too has improved somewhat, and we can continue to push in those realms. The voter turnout has been quite high with other demographic groups in Minnesota.
So speaking of that, you said that you have seen the increase in younger voters. Do you find them more involved in politics recently? And I don't know if you follow that or.
Well, I'd like to think that we've always had in Minnesota a lot of young activists. Mm-hmm. One of the things we've done differently, I think, in recent years is really push voting opportunities closer to where young people are. For example, in St. Paul College, the community college that's kind of kitty corner across from the Capitol, that college has offered an early voting site in the last couple of years, which it didn't previously. That really helps when you've got busy college kids who also have lots of jobs, full-time or part-time. If they can vote easily as they're moving from one class to the next, it makes a big difference. Getting those kinds of opportunities, more of those kind of opportunities on all college campuses, public and private, appeals to me quite a bit.
So going kind of back to number of state legislators, do you support, or what is your view of a reduction in the number of state legislators?
Well, I guess I'm kind of a New Englander at heart. The Sturdevant line is my Yankee line, so I guess I have come by that a little bit, honestly. I like the idea of government being close to the people and representatives being able to door knock a district and being able to be known personally by the people that they represent. If our districts get too large, that becomes impossible. And in fact, some would say that our districts are already too large for that to happen. There's something to be said for keeping a citizen legislature and keeping those representatives close to the people. And so for those reasons, I would not favor shrinking the size of the legislature.
Yeah, I saw a quote one time about the size of New Hampshire's legislature, because it's over 300 people. It was a comedian talking about it. He's like, Sparta only needed 300 people to fight off the Persians, but New Hampshire needs this many people. But it's like you said, it's that connection to the citizenship. And
it's a very traditional democracy, participatory democracy. And if you believe that this should be of the people, coming from the people, I think that there's something to be said for a large legislature.
What do you think of ranked choice voting?
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to talk about that. I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting. I think that one of the ways that we could improve turnout is to offer more of a colorful multi-party system. And Minnesota's laws are very friendly to third parties, the evidence of that is that we elected a third-party governor as recently as 1998. We have an opportunity in Minnesota to allow third parties to flourish. And why don't they? Well, because the two-party system makes it such that many people think that if I cast a vote for a third party, my vote is wasted. I'll be a spoiler. I'll wind up electing the candidate I like least, rather than really electing the candidate I'm most content with. Ranked choice voting does away with that spoiler problem. It allows a multiple ballot, a multiple candidate election to take place, and voters can rank their choices 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you can wind up through the sorting of ballots with a majority result. We need majority rule for our democracy to be legitimate. You can argue that the filibuster and other things that happen, including the way our electoral college functions, we have already more minority rule in the United States than we ought to have. ranked choice voting assures majority rule while allowing this multiplicity of voices. I think if people had more opportunities to plug into political organizations that they could really believe in, we might get more participation. And yet giving them an opportunity to keep a majority winner makes good sense. So I'm a big fan of ranked choice voting. We're about to have a ranked choice voting election again here in Minneapolis and in St. Paul. This will be, I think, the 4th go round in Minneapolis and the 3rd one in St. Paul. People are excited about it.
What is that election for?
Oh, the city elections this year in Minneapolis. They're the mayor and city council, and in Minneapolis, the park board and the board of investment and taxation, the usual run of city elections.
Gotcha. Is there, so Don Supala asks, is there any chance that we would see online voting in his lifetime? I'm not sure what that.
Don, I hope we continue to vote with a paper trail. Mm-hmm. As Don will remember, we have a propensity in Minnesota for close elections. We are a state that has had 2 lively parties, and occasionally outcomes get pretty close. We have the record in 1962 of the closest gubernatorial election in U.S. history. My good friend Elmer Anderson losing to Carl Rolvag by 91 votes. And you remember that Al Franken beat Norm Coleman in 2008 by 312 votes. When that happens, you need to have a paper trail so people we have a system for recounts that's quite specific and quite elaborate, and recounts are done in a way that's we're not talking about the kind of audit that's going on in Arizona right now as with Republican funding. We're talking about a regular system with nonpartisans in charge, and being able to see the paper ballots, and then having the paper ballots, if necessary, seen by judges. So those judges can finally adjudicate the intent of the voter. That's been a big help for us in Minnesota, keeping people willing to accept the results of recounts as legitimate. So I think that's why, Don, I'm not too keen on any kind of touchscreen or electronic voting.
Do the state legislators have other jobs, or are they considered full-time employees?
Yeah, they're not full. We do not have a full-time legislature. However, in years like the one we've just had, with special sessions so frequently, we've wound up working them pretty much around the clock. And so it's become increasingly difficult for people with what I think of as regular jobs to serve in the legislature. And I think it's a problem. I went back and looked at the 1971 legislature. These are legislative manuals. I can just grab the 1971 book here. And it looked at the ages and the occupations of legislators in 1971. And I chose that year because it was the last time we had a legislature that was nonpartisan, didn't have party labels on the ballot, and it only met every other year in the odd numbered year, didn't meet every year. So it was a different legislature with a different kind of time commitment. We had a lot of farmers, we had a lot of small business people, we had a lot of lawyers. We don't have very many of any of them anymore. We have now a lot of independent consultants. We have quite a few teachers still, though not as many as we did, I think. The other big change was in the age profile. It used to be we had a lot of people who were in their 30s and 40s as legislators, and now we have quite a few in their 20s, quite a few in their late 50s, 60s, and 70s. People are willing to do this kind of thing after their bulk of their earning years are behind them, or they're willing to do this at the beginning of their earning years and hope that it will be a springboard to something else. But the people who are in those middle years, raising families and paying taxes, aren't as well represented at our legislature as they should be, and I regret that. So these are some of the concerns that I have about whether our legislature is full-time or not. If we were to switch to more of a time commitment, would that make it easier for those 30 and 40 and early 50-year-olds to serve, or not as easy? I would be interested in what you in this group would have to say about that.
Well, I think one of the problems with serving in the legislature is trying to find like the compensation for it. So if it becomes full-time, are you being paid in such a way that you can afford to raise that family?
No.
You know,
as recently as 4 years ago, legislators in Minnesota were paid $31,000 a year. And there had been a push for many, many years to increase that for something that is usually 7 or 8 months of the year when you factor in the campaign demands. There was a constitutional amendment passed to give the power to raise, to set legislative salaries, give it to a commission rather than to the legislature itself. And that passed. And as a result, now we've had a commission for several years. And I know some of the people who've served on that commission, and they felt pretty strongly we needed to increase that salary, which is now up to about $47,000 a year. Big increase over the 31 that was the salary for quite a long time. Still, maybe not enough to attract some people in that 30, 40, early 50-year-old age group, where we again, I still see us being not as represented as they should be in our legislature. So would more pay make a difference? Would a different calendar make a difference? Some states have a relatively shorter session in the spring, but have a regular session every fall for about a month. Would that be, at least in the odd numbered years, something to consider? I've kind of liked that idea because I've seen it work well in some other states.
I have a note in the chat that New Hampshire legislatures get paid $200 per 2-year term.
See, there's that citizen legislature. The notion there is we keep people in their real world jobs, earning their incomes in real world ways, and the serving in the legislature is a sideline. Minnesota has a much bigger state budget than New Hampshire does, and it's a larger state in population too. So you have to wonder, would that really work in Minnesota, given the complexity of our state government? I'm not sure what. But that is the theory, and it's being played out in New Hampshire.
Do you have any thoughts on term limits?
I'm against them. I felt bad the other day. I was on a call with a group, and a former legislator I really admire as a strong backer of term limits. And I said, "Oh, Kathy, I'm so sorry, but I can't join you on that." Term limits tend to shift power to staff and to lobbyists, who become the sources of institutional memory, become the real knowledgeable voices on some matters in the tax code or the school aid formula, that kind of thing. The long-serving legislators now provide some of that expertise that would disappear from the ranks of the elected folks if we had term limits. I think that's not a good trade. I also think I've observed that in Minnesota, we have relatively few long-serving legislators. And the ones we have are some of our better legislators. They have an independence that I admire. They have a commitment I admire, and because some of them come from relatively competitive districts, they're there because their voters want them there, and have sent them time and again. They're not coasting necessarily to re-election. Now there are some exceptions to that, of course, but I wouldn't trade some of those long-serving legislators for some of the rookies. And by the time those rookies under term limits would be finally learning the ropes, they'd be gone. I think Minnesota, as there was a study done once on how long do legislators typically serve, and it was under 8 years. That's not a state that needs a change in term limits. The voters are taking care of that themselves. That and the legislators themselves by not being willing to stick around too long.
So you were talking earlier about like really close elections, and has there ever been an example where there's a tie in an election, and how would a winner be determined?
In local elections there have been, and Minnesota's state law specifies what to do with that. It has to do with flipping a coin. All of this is spelled out. We've had so many weird elections. Oh my, Don, I see Don smiling. Yeah, we've had elections where airplanes fall out of the sky. We've had elections where candidates have nasty things are learned about candidates who then withdraw at the last minute. We've had all kinds of stuff happen. And so our election laws are pretty detailed, spelling out some strange things that can happen. And it does speak to what happens when there's a tie.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have any opinion on free staters who move into an area or a state to try and change laws to fit with their ideals/beliefs?
Well, that's what the American system permits is mobility. We are not going to close our borders. And so as a journalist, I've always, and an editorial writer for all those years, I'm a believer in the contest of ideas. And people are sincerely participating for the right reasons of citizenship. That contest of ideas is healthy and robust, and something we ought to not be afraid of. It's concerning when the contest of ideas is overtaken or corrupted by people whose motives aren't so sincere, and that leads us to some comments about social media. We had, I think, for sure in the 2016 election and perhaps in 2020 as well, we had malevolent actors. Some of them, I'm sure, are Russians, who've allowed Americans to see things on social media that are just simply not true. That's not what you're asking about, Abby. I don't think, when you talk about the kind of people who would move into a state to try to change that state's politics. Right now, with social media, people who want to change a state's politics don't necessarily have to move. They can use social media, and sometimes in a rather malign way. We all have more need than ever to be discerning consumers of mass media. And that includes social media. I have this conversation with my 93-year-old mother a fair amount of time. Don't believe everything you read on Facebook. Check it out, and check it out with good sources. And here are some good sources if you think you're lacking those. We all need to become more sophisticated about that, because our democracy is at risk when people are in a wholesale way believing things that aren't true. My friend Elmer Anderson, the governor I mentioned, who lost by 91 votes, was a newspaper owner, among other things. And he used to always say, I trust the people to make good decisions if they get the facts. And it's been part of my honor and duty as a journalist to help them get the facts. That's actually more of a struggle now than ever because of the multiplicity of voices on social media.
So what are some of those sources that you recommend to make sure that we are well informed?
Well, I tell people to stick with newspapers, and that sounds really self-serving coming from someone who took a paycheck from the Star Tribune for as many years as I did. But newspapers are in this country still trying very hard with a business model to serve the whole community. They're not trying to serve a narrow niche of the community. Our business model is to serve the whole and deliver to advertisers a large mass audience, as opposed to an audience that is excited about only a certain set of ideas. As a result, the journalists who work at a newspaper are truly trying to do that fair and balanced and objective thing, as opposed to using the tactics of entertainment to create outrage and anger and a sense of sort of tribal identity, which is another way to deliver an audience to advertisers, but it's a way that I think is not as helpful to democracy as the kind of models that newspapers have. Newspapers have the biggest newsrooms, more journalists involved, and much more careful editing. They stand by their stories with a much more robust system of accuracy checks and corrections. Fact checking is much more robust at newspapers. So I tell people, stick with newspapers. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to read it on paper, you understand?
Obviously, that's the ideal way, but
if you're used to a paper's still fine, but I tell my kids digital subscriptions are just fine too. Stick with newspapers.
And then you mentioned earlier something at the New York University that you had been checking.
The Brennan Center for, I think it's called the Brennan Center for Law and Justice, but help me out if I've got that wrong. The Brennan Center at New York University is the go-to source for all kinds of stuff regarding voting rights, voter legislation. They're good. They're very, very up to date. They're a neutral, academically based commentary, but they keep track of the numbers. And that's everybody in my business that writes about this stuff uses the Brennan Center, named after former Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, who was really a pro and really good in all these topics, really a democracy advocate.
So, and going back to your comment about newspapers, do you think that the lack of local newspapers, or the fact that those numbers are dropping off, is causing less qualified people to be elected because they aren't being covered, like they aren't being vetted and covered as well?
Well, I won't go that far yet as to say that means less qualified people are being elected, but I will say that it is a worry to me. It's a risk that we don't hold local officials as accountable as we would if we had robust local newspapers. And we've just in the last few weeks, we lost another one in Minnesota. The International Falls paper went belly up. We've lost too many. We are blessed in the Twin Cities to have local ownership for the Star Tribune. Glenn Taylor is a fine owner. He keeps his hands off of the news content, and he is not trying to shrink us and take profits away from us and move them to somewhere else. I'm afraid I can't say the same about the Pioneer Press's owner, who's not been kind to that newsroom. We have a bigger newsroom today than we did when Glenn Taylor bought us. We've just won a couple of Pulitzer Prizes. I feel good about all of that. The quality of journalism that's being practiced at the Star Tribune, my old employer, is I think pretty high.
I don't see any new questions in the chat. Does anyone have any last questions before we wrap up? And Lori, I did want to let you know that the Rochester division of the League of Women Voters was on the call tonight.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so April Horn had, I believe, 4 other people with her, all from that group. So they
Well,
were.
let me say hello to them and thank them for their good work through the years. I really am so keen on the work of the League of Women Voters in a thoughtful and neutral way, both encouraging voter participation and encouraging fact-based understanding of some of the issues that are before us. The League has done a fine service, and it needs to stay strong.
They're saying thank you in the chat, so I feel like this weird mouthpiece in between, but I just wanted to let you know that they were here too, because we had talked about them.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so I think we're going to wrap up for tonight. So thank you so much to our audience for asking so many great questions, and to our presenter for sharing her time and expertise with us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you will continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from trains in Rochester to housing covenants and so much more. Check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our events and programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Good night.